Thank you, Chair. Well, since 1967, ASEAN, led in all but name by Indonesia, has gained a formidable reputation as an inclusive and consensus-based forum for multilateral diplomacy. It has spawned a sophisticated array of sometimes overlapping institutions to promote peaceful interaction amongst its stakeholders, who include the world's most powerful or potentially most powerful countries. In comparison, ASEAN countries themselves, all except Indonesia, are like minnows among whales. Yet, Vice President Hamid Ansari at the Chulalongkorn University expressed only recently India's firm faith in ASEAN to help with promoting her growing engagement in the Asia-Pacific under the Act East policy. He reminded the audience that India has some very special civilizational links with ASEAN, which makes for a comfortable and trusted international partner. Remember that half the world's merchandise shipping and a quarter of its petroleum passes through the Straits of Malacca, while a significant amount of bulk carriers too big to use the Malacca Straits pass through the Straits of Lombok and Makassar. These are all in ASEAN. As shipping and flow of trade and energy increases, so will the possibility of historical disputes over sovereignty and ownership. Will they be contained or reach a point of no return? Will ASEAN remain center stage in managing ongoing rapid developments, both external and internal to her? Or will she, as some people fear, collapse from institutional overload? How long will ASEAN continue to display the robustness, capacity, and willingness to shape the Asian century, which we so much want her to do? ASEAN has grown steadily to become the world's most successful regional organization. Its success rate in forging intra-ASEAN economic integration has been positive, but even more positive has been its management of cross-cutting pressures, which have been growing in tandem with the region's complex security needs. During, but especially after the Cold War, ASEAN's role as architect of parameters of dialogue between stakeholders in the Asia-Pacific, its capacity to anticipate shifting world event trends and shape the agenda accordingly, and its capacity to reimagine itself with changing external circumstances has been nothing short of remarkable. Mandated by the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation to forego war as a means of settling disputes, ASEAN has succeeded in making the idea of war unthinkable, which is an achievement which SAARC next door could emulate. The proof of ASEAN's wisdom and far-sightedness can be gauged from the fact that the defense budgets of each member country are tiny in comparison with their booming populations and economic growth. Undoubtedly, the security umbrella of the US and its alliance system during and even after the Cold War for some time helped. But even so, ASEAN's growth was by no means guaranteed, as witness the record of many countries in other parts of the world who were also recipients of US largesse. Credit for ASEAN's early success goes to her leadership and its distinct diplomatic style, which was sometimes criticized for its ambivalence and indirect approach, but which succeeded because it was understood and broadly accepted by ASEAN's many diverse and often disputatious members, who became even more diverse in ideology and economic standards after they were joined by Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and then Myanmar in the early 1990s. By honing a familial culture of trust and confidentiality, non-interference in internal affairs, and decisions by consensus, ASEAN gained formidable political capital. Indonesia went even further, deliberately keeping a low profile and leading, so to say, from behind. Growth in each ASEAN country was fairly equitable, which gave them the resilience which was so admirably displayed during the financial crisis years. That's 1997-98. In 1993, with the Cold War over, ASEAN added a security forum, ARF, to allow dialogue partners to engage in discussions of traditional and increasingly non-traditional security, that is to say piracy, drug trafficking, oil spills, the haze, environmental pollution, uncontrolled migration, child trafficking, diseases of various kinds, and later Islamic terrorism. All these and more followed the contraction of US's full spectrum dominance of the waters of the Asia Pacific. ASEAN, who earlier saw these problems as domestic and therefore not to be aired openly, now recognized the need for interstate cooperation in sensitive areas. In the center of ARF, it placed itself to do what it does best, that is, use its accumulated credibility and diplomatic prowess to encourage all stakeholders to bring their security concerns to a common table. Unlike NATO, ARF is inclusive and prevents no one, regardless of size or ideological persuasion, from expressing their views. It has been sometimes criticized as a talk shop, but is gratefully used by all interested major powers. After the financial crisis, ASEAN introduced even more drastic changes to its institutional structure. As chairman of ASEAN in 2003, Indonesia, now a democracy and determined to make up for lost time, proposed at the Bali summit to dilute the earlier culture of ambivalence and institutionalized ASEAN's aims and objectives through a charter, which would also provide for a human rights watchdog. The earlier informal approach had outlived its usefulness and indeed had cost the country and its neighbors dearly by failing to provide early warning signs of the impending crisis. The Bali summit also launched a proposal for an ASEAN community by 2020, later advanced to 2015, which was conceptualized in three ways: political security community, the economic community, and a socio-cultural community. These three bodies were expected to encourage the gradual replacement of national identity with regional or ASEAN identity, which was necessary to prevent ASEAN from pulling in different directions, which had happened during the crisis. Also proposed at Bali was the setting up of a peacekeeping force, which did not fly at that time, but which may now. Another major change in response to the financial crisis was APT, ASEAN plus 3, that's to say China, Japan, and Korea. The institution was set up in gratitude for help given in ASEAN's hour of need, when the three countries had helped with a currency swap arrangement. And China in particular had refrained from taking advantage of the crisis by devaluing her currency. APT is today the most energetic of the ASEAN-spawned institutions, but it is exclusive, and several Asia-Pacific players are not in it. A few years later, in 2005, therefore, perhaps to hedge against the possibility of China's rise not being as peaceful as promised, or maybe to ensure that it would be as peaceful as promised, ASEAN was persuaded by Indonesia and Singapore, in particular, disregarding strong Chinese objections, to set up yet another institution, the EAS, or East Asia Summit. It comprises ASEAN plus APT plus Australia, New Zealand, and India, to which were added US and Russia in 2011. The ADMM Plus and the RCEP are the last two institutions to have been established, or at least conceived of, respectively for security consultations at the defense ministerial level, and to bring different FTAs of ASEAN under one umbrella. This, in brief, is the trajectory which ASEAN has followed to arrive at where it is today. At each stage, it has ensured continuity of two central ideas, that decisions are by consensus, and that no stakeholder, however small and powerless, fails to get a hearing. It is the world's only known multilateral organization in which the weak lead the strong. Or maybe the lead is not the right word, for ASEAN persuades and socializes its dialogue partners. It does not lead them. It persuades by example and ensures that they remain focused on the common good. Amitav Acharya even says that Asia's changing regional environment is more likely to change Chinese and great power behavior than vice versa, which may sound audacious, but I tend to agree. Paradoxically, in 2016, when the ASEAN community has supposedly arrived, The exuberance which one had expected is nowhere to be seen. Instead, there's apprehension, perhaps a crisis of confidence, as ASEAN members are expressing doubts about ASEAN's longevity and capacity to cope with the demands on its time and resources. According to newspaper reports, the goalpost of ASEAN community vision has been moved to 2025 to allow time for deeper public identification with the concept. Reducing sovereignty is apparently too radical an idea yet for many ASEAN members to wholeheartedly accept. As with several crises which have faced ASEAN in the past, the key to unlocking this one too may lie with Indonesia. A feeling has emerged of late, encouraged by Indonesian officials themselves, that Indonesia has outgrown ASEAN. She is said neither to care about ASEAN concerns nor to give priority to smoothing ruffled feathers in the organization, which she used to do. President Jokowi said in his election campaign that the South China Sea dispute is other countries' problem. And recently, a key Indonesian official declared that ASEAN is no longer the pillar of Indonesia's foreign policy, but only a pillar. I'm confident, however, that these signals are not life-threatening for ASEAN. President Jokowi is by nature bilateralist, and a change of style is expected with a change of presidency. He has launched a bold new initiative for Indonesia, a vision of a global maritime fulcrum spanning the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And by drawing in massive Chinese investments for it, he's not only realizing his vision, but hedging against the possibility of a turnaround on Natuna. He wants to connect far-flung provinces of Indonesia, which will help secure her and the neighborhood from jihadi terror, the IS. And boosting Indonesia's puny defense and naval capabilities can only help. By becoming a realist, as reports suggest, it does not necessarily follow that Indonesia under President Jokowi has forgotten the imperative of a free and active foreign policy and strengthening strategic autonomy of Indonesia. Deprioritizing the neighborhood would surely jeopardize Indonesia's own security in the long run. Perhaps her foreign policy advisors are only suggesting to ASEAN that Indonesia is no longer willing to keep a low profile and lead from behind like before. Or maybe the confident and democratic Indonesia under new president is unwilling to continue as thought leader of ASEAN without open acknowledgement of her leadership status. It is not possible to second-guess Indonesian intentions, but without ASEAN, Indonesia will surely carry less international weight. More important is the problem of lack of resources. That's, in my view, that's a much more important problem to run the ASEAN Secretariat and the work overload from organizing over 1,000 conferences and meetings annually, an ever-growing agenda, and insufficient powers for the Secretary General. Suggestions for trimming the workload, prioritizing projects, upgrading the SG's role, even creating a new secretariat for the EAS have been made and are no doubt being considered. Many countries, including India, have posted an ambassador to ASEAN who is available for consultations if required. Strengthening the EAS seems like a good idea. As for external pressures on ASEAN, the most serious of these is the possibility of its cracking up under opposing pulls of US and China. That ASEAN will not be able to withstand another situation as happened in Cambodia in 2012, when a communique failed to be adopted, is quite clear. There are also strains building up from TPP and AIIB, which have divided the members of ASEAN. Singapore's Prime Minister Loong hopes that eventually China will join the TPP and US and Japan will join the AIIB. And I think that India too must hope for the same, because we do not wish to belong to any alliance system, however closely India's interests may lie with some powers. China, as a permanent member of UNSC, is actually quite comfortable, this is my view, with the world order, and unlikely to want it changed except in some details. It has much to lose in terms of access to the global commons itself if there's too much volatility in the South China Sea. Every major power in the world, for that matter, including US and China, is today too intimately connected with the world's financial, production, and manufacturing networks to want to risk rupture of the existing order. As I began by saying, India fully supports the ASEAN route to peace and community building through inclusivity and consensus seeking in the Asia-Pacific. Aiming to gain legitimacy rather than exercising raw power is always better policy. The alternative scenario of carving out exclusive spheres of influence is too grim to contemplate, and in any case, anomalous in today's interconnected world. To conclude, I believe ASEAN will deliver peace as wisely in the Asia-Pacific in future as it has in the past, but she will need wisdom and support from other stakeholders also. If there has been a feeling that India has not lived up to its role as security provider, it should have been put to rest since PM Modi came to power. India's government today is collaborating fully with the regional players in the security domain. Evidence of India's prowess and willingness to serve the cause of peace and security in the Asia-Pacific was fully displayed at the International Fleet Review at Visakhapatnam 10 days ago, when Prime Minister Modi affirmed that the security and growth of all in the Asia-Pacific region is one of his government's top priorities. ASEAN should therefore have no doubts, at least as far as India's support is concerned. Thank you.